Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jane, and thanks to everybody who's with us this morning. It's always a pleasure to be with fellow travelers and fellow mischief makers. And in many respects, when we're talking about resilience, we're talking about playfulness. We're not talking about an end or even necessarily a journey. We're talking about something that's more about a dance. If you're expecting a paint by numbers, and I know none of you on this call will be, there isn't one. There really isn't a map that sets out the course of resilience. But I do think there's a compass. So in many respects, that's what I want to talk about this morning, how we can make resilience real where we are in our lives as much as in the lives of other people. Last night, I was on a call and had the pleasure of being with some elders from Edmonton who were sharing their insights around an Indigenous lens on what we're experiencing these past few months. And their observation was in their tradition of seeing things, they view Mother Earth, as having the ability to communicate. It's a very different way of thinking, perhaps, to the Western way of thinking. But their observation was that in many respects, what we're going through is an initiation, something that challenges and calls forth resilience and a much more just way of moving forward. Now, they explained to me last night that an initiation or a rite of passage has three different stages. The first is separation. We get separated from each other. Sound familiar? The second is trial in some way. Sound familiar? The third is return. Sound hopeful? And in many respects, we're hearing the language of build back better, but I don't want to return to some of the stuff that we've been living through pre-COVID. I don't know about you. But I'm much more interested in flourishing forward fairly rather than back better. Better is a useful narrative. So I want to really think about what would flourishing forward fairly look like if we took this notion that everybody has a contribution. And with that in mind, I just wanted to call up a slide deck to share. I won't bore you too much with PowerPoint, but it is helpful to just be able to have a couple of visual references as much as anything. The question that I wanted to center my comments around this morning is, what do you care about enough to act on with your neighbors? So really thinking about the neighborhood as the primary unit of change, not the person, not physical activity, and not the institution. All of these things can be included, but thinking about the neighborhood as the primary unit of change and thinking about that as the scale within which we can really begin to figure out what this thing called resilience looks like. How do you actually make it real on Monday morning or Saturday evening? How do you do it while maintaining physical distancing? One of the things that epidemiologists are telling us now, the folks who know more about this kind of pandemic than I do for sure, are saying we may have to actually adjust to a pandemic conscious future. There will be most likely other pandemics. So how do we organize ourselves to be resilient, or what some people are now calling anti-fragile? That's the question. I have a couple of thoughts on this, but rather than spend too much time talking at you, what I thought would be fun to do is to try to mix it up a little bit. So I will give micro inputs rather than give a big, long, droning keynote and then questions at the end. What I wanted to try to do is model how we grow resilience as well as speak about it and share ideas around it. And so what you will experience over the next hour or so is a mix of me giving input, and most importantly, certainly more importantly, you in small group conversation actually playing with intentional questions that I offer you. So let me give a little input by way of setting up the first breakout session that we're going to have today. I call this the Golden Highway. So as I said, there is no roadmap, but there's a compass. And the Golden Highway offers us a little bit of an orientation or a wayfinder when it comes to finding genuine resilience, which is enduring and which is bottom up. All resilience is bottom up. It's inside out, it's bottom up. So one of the challenges we have, this is the three-lane highway, right? The Golden Highway. One of the challenges we have is nearly all our conversations about our communities and the people who live there are framed around the question, what do communities need outside agencies to do for them? Now, it was interesting in March, April, and May, as the institutional world started to recede, furloughs, hitting the limits of its capacity, protecting the NHS from being overrun, etc. It was almost like a hydraulic pump. As the institutional world went down on one side, we started seeing the community world go up on the other side. It was almost as if our neighbors became our first responders, our neighborhoods became our front line. And in many respects, there was a view that if things were going to get done during that period, it was going to be up to us and our neighbors to do them. And not universally, but certainly significantly. And around the world, we were hearing people use terms that had nearly fallen out of coinage, terms like mutual aid, helping our neighbors. We were sharing stories on Facebook and Instagram and all the different platforms that we use about Italians serenading each other from the balconies during lockdown, about Irish families playing bingo out of their garages, and all kinds of other things. That wasn't happening out of the third lane. What can institutions do for communities? It was happening out of the first. It was in answer to the question, number one, what is it that communities can do best, even in times of crisis? So these three questions, I see them as like three lanes on a highway, I think are critical to resilience. And getting the sequence right is absolutely vital. So instead of this idea that we're going to create a whole load of programs that are going to build resilience in a community, what I want to ask is, could we change that conversation around a little bit? And instead start the conversation with what's already going on in our communities that proves resilience, and how might we be able to cheer that on and, if possible, and by invitation, extend that. So starting with the first lane, what is it communities can do best themselves, and really moving into a discovery rather than a delivery mode of showing up as outsiders, particularly if you're on the call as professionals, but not just. If you're leaders in your community, could we as leaders think about ourselves as leaders as conveners rather than leaders as heroes? I really think that what we're learning through this period is it's time to send our heroes home and to make hospitality the leader, to make process the leader, and starting with different questions. Answers and opinions have divided this world. I do a lot of work in the US and across the UK, and it's pretty clear to me that if we stay stuck on opinion, we're going to end up divided. Answers divide communities. Better questions build community and build resilience. So a powerful question, I think, is what is already going on in our communities, and how can we cheer that on and build on that? So what is it communities can do best? The second lane, what is it they can do with some outside help? And then, and only then, what else do they need done for them? I think that's the sequence of resilience. And that changes the conversation. I think it literally turns it on its head, because an awful lot of the conversations we're having are not going in that direction. And so what I'd like to do is, just having set that up, is to stop for a moment and to offer you these two questions in small group session as we really begin to think about, when you think about your role, whether it's as a citizen in a local community, you see yourself as a volunteer, if that's the language you use, you see yourself as a paid practitioner, however you show up in the world, as a mix maybe of all of those things. When you think about being alongside people, how might you shift your conversation more often? I'm not saying you don't do it already, but more often, away from those conversations that start with how can I help you, or what can I do for you, or how can I get you more active, towards what would you like to contribute to the well-being of your community? What would you like to contribute to the well-being of your community? And how can I support you? And if you're one of these people who believe that there's a whole set of people out there who are not as good as you and are not as able as you will not build people up by putting them down. So shaking your head and saying there's a whole subset of people who need me to rescue them is a real good way of confirming your own bias. But actually showing up in people's lives, curious and respectful, and of the belief that they have as sharp a mind and as noble a heart as you do. And maybe they're as good as you in all kinds of different ways. They just are different. Maybe they've got labels that are blocking you from seeing what they have to offer. But imagine we shifted the conversation. So I really want to play with that. The second question I'd like us to spend a little time on is, what dilemmas do you face in adapting that kind of approach, in starting with the first lane in the highway rather than the third? What barriers are you going to hit? Are you working with a bureaucratic system that's going to say, sorry, unless you hit this key performance indicator, we're not going to allow you to work trusting relationships up with the community? Or is there a dilemma within yourself? Do you not really believe that people have gifts, have capacities? And if that's the case, that's okay. Let's talk that through. So I'm going to stop for a moment. I'll put these questions into your breakout session. For now, I want to stop. It always creeps up on me, this, you never have enough time. So hopefully you got a chance to kind of say hi to each other and connect with each other there, and really begin to think about what is, I think, at the heart of the resilience dilemma, which is, how do we relocate power? How do we relocate authority? And think about people not as consumers of what we call our help, but very much as key drivers themselves. Love to hear from maybe 2 or 3 people. This is a keynote, so we're trying to do this within an hour, but your voice is important. So if you can keep that focus, that would be really appreciated. Anybody care to unmute and just tell us what surfaced in their small group in relation to those 2 questions that I asked you to think about?
Our group, we really talked about empowerment, so shifting power. Instead of it being like we've got all the power, to actually share. So about believing in people, valuing them, listening to what they've got to say, being flexible, giving responsibility, and trusting that people can make a valuable contribution. So like using their own skills and what they bring to the table, let them take the lead. Brilliant.
That's brilliant, Jan. And thanks so much for starting us off there.
I'll say something quickly.
Roxanne, thank you.
Sorry, Cormac.
That's okay. I've been called.
So we talked a little bit about the necessity for spending the time and doing the research, and getting out into communities and really understanding what each individual community has to offer. And once you can identify those skills, rather than doing to the community, being able to help them to collaborate, share those skills across those communities for people that might require them, either professionally or personally. And we also said, in terms of a dilemma that might be faced, is communicating with different demographic groups. So some are easier than others, and sometimes, for example, youth groups might be less communicated with in terms of what they feel is needed than other groups in a community.
Brilliant. That's really, really good. And I think, as you say, Roxanne, you've got this kind of dilemma, don't you? If you work with an organization that expects you to deliver, you've got to set that to one side and really go and spend the time discovering. But sometimes discovery can be more complex with some than others. Fantastic. Let's hear from one other before we go on. Anybody else want to pitch in?
I just say that again, well, we're thinking more about young people,
Okay.
and we identified, similar to the last comment, that the importance of building that initial relationship and actually letting the young person say how they want to work with you, and whether they want to engage, and having it very much being led by them, and so that they can recognise, that it's going to be useful to them and that they're in control.
Absolutely. And I think one of the challenges we have often as outsiders coming in to try to engage with young people or any group is it's very, very hard for us to do that in a way that isn't about selling our agenda to them. Even an awful lot of the community engagement and youth participation, the most progressive techniques that I've seen, they still have an agenda. They still have a worthy outcome. They have something in mind for this young person. And I think that's one of the biggest hurdles to resilience. So thank you for that, Kirsty. It's really powerful. Let me build on what you've been saying and just maybe riff a little bit on some of the ideas. First thought is, I would tend to expand the term empowerment a little bit and maybe challenge it just slightly in the name of talking about resilience. And I think while we all know what we mean by empowerment, it's almost like the weather, but we're confusing the climate with the weather. So I think what we actually mean by empowerment is not a situation where, for example, I empower you, because if I empower you, who's got the power? I do. And that means I can take it away again. That's not going to create a resilient outcome. It might actually make you feel more developed. It might give you a skill set, but your resilience, not so sure. So I think one of the things we want to think more about is how do we create the climate within which self-empowerment and productive connections at the neighborhood level are more likely because of something we did or didn't do, actually, as well, right? So sometimes it's about how are we going to get out of the way? How are we not going? You know, it really seems to me that if you think about the opposite of resilience, which might be disablement, I think it's pretty clear in my mind that one of the reasons people, especially young people, become disabled is because somebody moves in and solves problems that don't belong to them. They belong to the young people, they belong to their communities, but we appropriate those problems and we turn the young person into a project to be fixed rather than a human being with creativity who needs to be supported. So it's a very, very different idea, but this idea of creating the conditions for self-empowerment and community empowerment rather than empowerment programs. I think they're two very different things. It's the weather and the climate. They're two different things. The other thing that I wanted to kind of pick up on, and it builds on this a little, is this idea of how do we actually get to a point where we relocate power and we relocate authority? And this is a huge, huge question. And to begin to unpack that a little bit, I want to introduce, so we started our journey this morning along what I call the Golden Highway, the 3 lanes, things that community can do themselves without any help, the second lane with help, and the third lane, stuff that they need done for them. And I suggested we need to get those lanes flowing and working in the right sequence. So why is it that so often, to go back to the question of dilemmas, why is it so often these lanes don't work in flow with each other? Or we find maybe sometimes folks are kind of crossing over a lane. So we have maybe outside agencies trying to be helpful, but in the act of being helpful, they sometimes create harm to resilience. They nearly create the opposite of what they intend. Not always, sometimes. So what's happening there? And a way of thinking about that is to think about when we're trying to be helpful and we're trying to promote resilience. I think what we've done is we've said, let's not do things that are chopped down to people. You know, let's leave the old style, traditional ways of doing things to and for people behind. And let's think about doing things with people, because that's how we create resilience. And what I want to suggest to you is I'm not always sure that that's actually the case. I think it can often be the case, but there's probably another way of creating resilience in my mind. And that's creating the conditions within which people can do things at neighborhood level by themselves, not even necessarily with us as professionals. I'm really struck by how often youth engagement is about a set of professionals who are really well qualified and very experienced engaging with young people and maybe getting young people to engage with their peers. You could call that the done with. Certainly better than done to and done for, there's no doubt. But what if we created the conditions within which we enabled young people to connect with productive adults in their neighborhood more? Unqualified, unpaid neighbors safely. I'm not promoting a reckless act here, but it's interesting to me. I often think about, you know, that wonderful adage that we have of the fish and the fishing rod. Now, the done to is this kind of top-down idea of why give somebody a fish, why teach them how to fish. it's a waste of time. I know the adage, if you give somebody a fish, they eat for a day. If you teach them how to fish, they fish for life. But let's dispense with all of that. Let's just give everybody cod liver oil tablets, because that's the best way to go. Let's just do it to them. We can't trust them to do it themselves anyway. So that's done too. It's a medical model. And I've seen that a lot in sport as well. I've worked with sport organizations all over the world, including across Canada and South Africa and Australia. And some at the elite level, they drive the agenda. It's done too. The other's done for. It's a charity model. They're too weak and they're not, bright enough to know how to learn to use a fishing rod. So let's just give them the fish. It's a relief action. And sometimes we use that approach very much at times of crisis. I think we've seen it very much lately. We're in a crisis. Let's just move into relief modality. Well, that happened 12, 13 years ago in Haiti. And there are still initiatives that are using a relief model of change making in Haiti. The storms have abated, the floods have stopped, the crisis is over, but they're still working out of a crisis modality, like one-trick ponies that can't change gear. So it's exciting in the UK, and particularly in Somerset, to see things so clearly being co-produced. And there are fantastic examples. In fact, I would say a lot of people are looking across the UK to what's happening in Somerset, to places like Frome and many other places. We have flat pack democracy coming out of your county. We have all kinds of really interesting initiatives like compassionate communities. So really a seed bed of innovation in terms of co-production. And I think worthy of being really proud of. So the danger sometimes, I think, is with co-production is that we get stuck in our own rules and our institutions. So again, to use the fish and the fishing rod, we end up saying, yes, of course, we want to coach people how to fish, but they have to use our regulation fishing rods, and they have to use our coaches who've done the 12-week program and have the the certification that's required. When a community says, well, hang on, we already have people who are very good at fishing, who are prepared to mentor young people, why don't you give us the resources and enable us to organize? Then we start really testing the limits of what is truly partnership, what is truly with communities. So what's done by? Well, done by is accepting that in some instances, to go back to some of the points that were made earlier on, communities don't like fish, or maybe they can't fish because their rivers are polluted. Maybe they want to do something else. And this is really the willingness to even accept that sometimes it isn't about doing things co-productively or in partnership, but it's about creating the space within communities so that they can figure out what they care about enough to act upon together, neighbor to neighbor, exactly like we saw in March and April, and to an extent in May. So with that in mind, I want to briefly, this time for about 5 minutes, just jump in really quickly again to a breakout and ask you, where are you hanging out in the to, for, with, by crossroads? Where are you hanging out? And just briefly consider what courage would be required of you to show up more in the by space. Really not partnering, not doing to, not doing for, not doing with, but really just creating space for communities to figure out what they want to do themselves, and accepting that may not line up with our institutional imperatives or desires. It may not give us a clear line of sight around moving more or physical activity, at least initially, but it's still worth doing. So I just really want you to think about those two questions really quickly. Let's take 7 minutes, we'll be generous. So let's take 7 minutes on that. So Sarah, without further ado, could you get us back into those? Okay, so welcome back. And again, I just wanted to point out that what we're doing here is we're using techniques to build resilience, even to build our own sense of trust with each other as a learning community for this short hour that we have together. And we're making the conversation the context, not the problem, not whatever the issue of the day might be or our worthy outcome. So this isn't about me getting you to agree with me. It's about us trying to be as best as we can in conversation with each other. So let's go to the second question, which is about what courage, because I don't think this work is technically hard to do, but I do think it's it requires moral imagination. So what courage do you feel is required of you to kind of relocate authority and to be more facilitative in the buy space, in the community-led space, to use that term? Does anybody care to share any thoughts on that, either from their group or from themselves personally?
That things go wrong or take a lot longer to kind of get going.
Yes, absolutely. Who am I hearing from? Angela, brilliant,
Yeah,
Angela.
hi.
Thanks for pitching in, Angela. Lovely to hear your voice and to see you. Well done. Yes, absolutely. So that sense of courage to maybe go at the speed of trust rather than the speed of an outcome or an election cycle or a funding cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Angela. Others?
I was going to say, it's Rachel. Yeah, I think it's the trying and being prepared to get burned, but then if you do get burned, or when you get burned, trying again. I think sometimes there's a risk that, oh well, we'll try this thing, oh, and then it didn't work, so then we pull back. But actually, we need the courage to sort of put our hand in the fire again, and also have the courage to stand back and ask the reflective questions. I think would be, ourselves.
That's okay. Don't worry. No, Rachel, that's really powerful. So the willingness to accept the challenges with the celebratory outcomes, but also then that willingness to learn. Yeah, and this is really important because an awful lot of evaluations currently are actually they're pressing against learning rather than opening it up. Summative, formative evaluations basically don't work towards learning. They're forms of auditing. And I know that Sport England and other organisations are trying to move away from that, but it's critical in this work if we're working with resilience. Deborah, would you like to share?
Yeah, we were talking about, a lot of us are funded to deliver work with our communities, and it's time bound. Yeah. And, you have your targets, but Beck said a very good thing. When we sort of do that engagement, maybe that's when we look at the done by, instead of saying we are going to deliver, we spend some time actually listening and asking them. So we have what maybe our aims are, but how can we, with them, and they take ownership of it, bring it forward? Because I think where we we're not time bound, we're able to do that. But for so many, there's a short period of time, or 3 years, and by the time you've engaged them and, you're having to do your KPIs.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I've learned that maybe I need to look at that engagement and getting them involved.
Yeah. And the challenge there, Deborah, is that sometimes even when we're doing that, when we're doing the engagement, it's a recruitment drive to get them to do what we want them to do. So we're turning volunteers into free labor to service our institutional imperative. So there's a dilemma there too, I think. And really it is about democratizing the way we show up in communities. And that does take courage. Just because you work for an organization that resembles the Navy doesn't mean you can't act like a pirate. And in many respects, we actually have to teach our leaders how to show up, and particularly funders and donors. So, but I do think there is that piece around, they won't change the rules of the game until we create a better alternative, so what does that look like? And I think you're right to open up that question and to kind of imagine into that. Good point. Thank you. Anybody else want to pitch in before I finish my keynote?
I was just going to mention about, I felt quite challenged about the whole fishing rod idea, which I believe in so much, and I felt I was absolutely doing. But it's like the prescribed rod, and we're giving out some funding at the moment. And I realise some of the groups is quite chaotic, and it's the chaos that can be created or continue if you just give them the money and let them do the good that they will. And I think the conviction is there that they're going to do good, but it could be quite chaotic. And that element of still wanting to hold a little bit of control and a bit of conformity to some of the rules because it's public purse money.
Absolutely.
So that's a challenge.
And also, I think some of the moral equity, like the inclusion of people not funding racist projects, etc. I mean, there's some very good reasons for rules as well, and I think we have to say that very clearly. It's about how the rules can actually advance social justice. Not all do, and being discerning at that level, and also how we can advance what we're doing not at the expense of social capital. So and that's complex. It's far from straightforward. But I think you're right. I think, one of the things that struck me over the years was initiatives like, for example, in Seattle city government, where very small amounts of money were used as a match, but the community themselves had to come up with ideas first. And every hour of a pledge with 3 or 4 of their neighbors was recognized as having a value of $15. But they had to come and share those stories with their community first. So there was a sense of openness and equity. And what I loved about those conversations is those were not conversations about people's opinions. They were conversations about what people were going to commit to do to make the community better. So it was about collective well-being. And I think you're right. I think there's that piece kind of ever before we invest in a project. We have projectitis, don't we? And programitis. It's saying the process matters more than the outcome. That the process that actually enables people to find out what they care about, to find out what assets they have to tap into, to connect those together and work even with people they don't agree with. That's the critical piece. And that's where I think we've gone very wrong in a lot of ways when we've convened people into meetings, we've made them write funding applications, and then we've asked them for their opinions and their expectations rather than their contributions and their passions. And it's a very, very different conversation. So thank you for drawing that out for us. Let me just share some closing comments. I mean, there's never enough time, is there, with these conversations, but there's enough to be getting on with. And I just wanted to try and draw a few thoughts together because we've co-created this keynote this morning in jig order. And it just shows you that actually, if you lead with questions, if you make conversation the context rather than the expert in the room setting the context. And if you really listen to people, you can actually shape things in all kinds of different ways. This keynote is as much a surprise to me as it is to you. And that's the way it should be. I could never have anticipated what you were going to say. And again, the context. I don't. I'm a guest in your conversation. In many respects, I think the conversations we're having is how do we create the conditions within which we can really hear people into expression as they talk about what a good life looks like, rather than us prescribing what we think a good life should look like for them. So what is the intrinsic motivation, not just personally, but also at neighborhood level, at associational level, so the clubs, the groups, the social networks. We've been talking about this idea of kind of getting on the first lane, really getting the conversation started very early with what's strong in communities, with what communities care about at the local level. And one of the challenges with that, of course, is people will push back and rightly say, hang on a second, a lot of our communities are disconnected. Not every community is as connected as Frome, for example. And even then, we had to do a lot of building of relationships and a lot of building of those connections. It didn't just happen by accident. And it's the same if you think about it in more negative terms. What COVID-19 had the effect of doing in a lot of communities is it precipitated mutual aid. So it was like, it obviously didn't define the outcome, but it created the climate or the conditions within which self-empowerment was a necessity. And even then, that didn't happen in all instances for all people. There are many, many people who are still exiled out of communities and at the edge of communities. And the measure of a strong community, I think, is not the extent to which its leaders show up or its volunteers volunteer. It's the depth of associational life. It's informal clubs and groups and associational networks and their ability to welcome the stranger at the edge. So this first lane is really, really complicated. It's a hard piece of work. And it isn't just about talking about problem solving or project making. It's actually about investing in building our neighborhoods and our villages for their own sake. Recently, I was sharing a story, which I'm going to share with you in a moment, about a community that's built its own neighborhood in Birmingham from inside out. And somebody who was listening to the story said, well, what was the intended outcome? And I told them the intended outcome was to build community from inside out. They said, no, I mean, was there a health outcome? Was there a physical activity outcome? Was there a safety outcome? And I just tried to very gently remind the person that they had kind of locked themselves into an echo chamber where the only words they can hear are words that are relevant in service land. KPI, performance indicator, Excel spreadsheets, which, by the way, are the vortex into which all innovation disappears. And that's a language that exists in a hollow resonance syndrome where we hear the sound of ourselves coming back at us. But when you actually go out into communities, most communities don't use these words, at least not in that way. And so finding a way of getting beyond that echo chamber and really, really hearing people into expression is important, because we can't know what communities need from outside agencies until communities themselves know what they have. You can't know what a person needs until a person knows what they have. And that's part of the difficulty. Nearly all of our needs assessments of communities conclude the same thing, and that is that what the communities who are being assessed need are the services and the programs of those who are assessing them. It's the fish and the fishing rod thing again. Well, says who? If people had, again, for professionals, myself included, if people had our salary, would they use the money to buy the services we provide them? Often the answer to that question is no. But the messy part, and it's scary, is how do we create the conditions within which we can enable people to figure out what it is they care about enough to get up and act upon, which, by the way, is physical movement and physical activity. If people define what they care about enough to act upon, and they can identify 3 or 4 neighbors they'd, be prepared to do that with, then you will get more movement. It may not come in the shape of sport, but you will move more. And so finding a way of intrinsically understanding these motivations is important. But the magic, the fairy dust gets sprinkled when people act on those things. And that's where resilience grows. When we act together with our neighbors, when we discover that we have a gift or a contribution, and we give that gift to other people and it's received. And as part of the challenge of this is, how do we discover that? We do that through learning conversations. We do that not by gathering people's opinions about what they think should be done to or for them, or even with them, but what it is they care about enough themselves that they'd love to do. What passions, what skills, what knowledge would they like to share? And how could we cheer them on? How could we support them to do that? And this is a very different conversation, I think, to the conversations we tend to have, which are less about treating people like citizens and more about treating people like clients who consume services. I think we need to move to citizenship. I think advancing the Move More agenda, the healthier movement, is all about citizenship. It's not about personal progress or elitism or us all becoming athletes. It's about us all showing up and contributing to the well-being of others in our communities. We actually get fitter and healthier, not from within by going off into a dark room on our own, but we get healthier by connecting with each other. We're social beings. And that's what mutual aid movements over the last while have really reminded us of again. But also, it's really important that we don't get stuck there. I mean, a lot of communities say wonderful ideas, but we can never make those ideas happen because we can't get the funding. Well, how about we just agree that that's true and say, while you're waiting for the funding, what would you love to do with the resources you have locally? What do we already have? Who do we already know that we could tap into here? And let's get started. Who else could we invite in? We've got schools. And we so often think of schools as places where children go to learn. Imagine if we thought about schools as assets for community building, where edible gardens can be created, where adults can go to learn at night, young people can go to skateboard in the evening times, so that schools are assets for community building, not just seats of learning. and so on and so forth. I mean, there's so many examples. One of the challenges that we face is that sometimes it's hard to picture our communities as anything other than the sum of their problems. And so I think we need to shift away from doing needs assessments, really into creating asset portraits, inventories of possibility, moving away from maps of misery to maps of potential. And beginning to see that in all kinds of ways, our communities are places that are full of, invisible possibility. Our challenge is to make the invisible visible. That's what creates resilience. The difficulty is that so often we've been doing the opposite. We've been identifying the absence of resilience. We've been identifying the absence of health, which is sickness, and confusing that with health. And what we really need to do, I think, is to start recognizing, like you've already done, that in all kinds of ways, there are reservoirs of assets and potential resilience in every single one of your communities. But the challenge is we've got to have the conversations that make the invisible visible, because not everybody can see these. Not everybody believes that's true. Now, it doesn't mean there won't be needs and there won't be issues. And we've found with communities like, for example, the community in Hodge Hill in Birmingham, where I've worked for the last 7 years, you've got to do a lot of hard work to really connect people, because a lot of people are more likely to be watching an episode of the American sitcom Friends than they are to be friends with their neighbors. And even though we've done it maybe a little bit during the pandemic, there's no guarantee that's going to continue. You know, it's much like, I suppose, exercising. We can go and, listen to a wonderful TED talk about the importance of exercise and spend 9 hours in the gym and come back and say, well, nothing's changed. I'm never going to exercise again because, I spent 9 hours on a treadmill. Nothing's changed. Or we could choose to actually spend 20 minutes every day doing something that's actually going to move us more and create marginal gain. Now, the second option is the better option. It's the same in building resilience. Figuring out what our threshold is and actually doing that consistently on a daily basis, that's the trick. And figuring out ways that we can do that, not just with individuals, but with cultures, is the critical way of building resilience in our communities. Across the last number of years, we've seen in neighborhoods like Hodge Hill and Birmingham, the way they've done that is these 8 touchstones, not in any particular order, not all of them in every place. But what they've essentially done is they've committed to building relationships, to finding local people who are serious, not just about a project, but about creating community connections, a culture of community connection and a caring community. And sometimes, yes, that involves recruiting a community animator or community development worker, somebody who knows how to work at street level and, as you were saying, knows how to really listen and build those relationships, but also reach out to the edge and welcome people who've been turned into strangers. But what is it they're doing? They're having conversations. They're connecting not just one person, but every person. And what are they asking? They're asking them, what are their skills? What are their gifts? What are their passions? What do they know well enough that they could teach a young person, or indeed learn from a young person? And then they're making those connections. This isn't about referral. This isn't about transaction. It's about building deep, deep relationships. People will join things when they know on the days they're not there that they're missed. People don't just join things for activity or because they want to get healthy. We're social beings. We join things to fall in love with each other, as wacky as that might sound. And I suppose, in a sense, as I draw to a close, one of the things that I wanted to come back to was just this very simple idea that community is in itself the idea that we're trying to promote. If we can build community at neighborhood, at village level, and actually enable everybody to recognize, in a radical sense, but a simple sense, you have a contribution and your contribution is welcome. And really lift the labels off of people and make sure there are no more throwaway people, that everybody's gift, everybody's contribution is invaluable. And I really think that's the critical thing. And I think you've done that very, very well in the county. It's only really when people who've been defined as the problem secure the power to redefine the problem that we can really rekindle democracy and resilience. So as you go forward, my invitation is stay in trouble, and keep doing what you're doing. Go deeper, invite more people in, and really believe in this idea that it's better to start with what's strong than what is wrong. Thank you very much for listening.
That's brilliant, Cormac. Thank you. I really enjoyed that, and I hope everybody else did. Few messages in the chat around the slides, and we will be sending those out. And there's some, if we could show Cormac our appreciation in the chat function with clapping hands or thumbs up, or for me a little heart. Thank you very much. So I took so much away while you're just doing that. I love the start of dance, not a journey. We always took a journey like it's a linear action, but it is a dance, and it isn't linear. And I think that that's really interesting. And flourishing forward fairly, so many of us deal with inequalities, which are all about the labels that actually sometimes do block what we see with people. And I think that, you know, there's something for us to take away and think about very carefully. And our good life isn't necessarily everybody's good life, and remembering that is important. And some of the other things that really resonated with me is volunteers, you know, shouldn't be free labour. How do we show up in our communities for our, you know, when we are asking people to contribute to their communities? Are we really only interested in them contributing to our agenda? So all of those things, I have lots and lots of things that I have taken away. And so I really want to thank you very, very much, Cormac.
It's a pleasure.
Absolutely
It's a pleasure,
great.
Jane. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Go well, guys. Enjoy the rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So great, we're going to have a chat about growth mindset. A growth mindset, if you've heard of it, can be a real help in developing and maintaining people's personal resilience for ourselves and for the people that we work with. So when we consider mindsets, our mindsets are really how we approach our life, and are made up of habits of the mind. And these are influenced heavily by the experiences we have. So understanding our mindset and how it shapes our life can create blind spots in maybe our ambition or our thinking. Occasionally encourages us to blame others or be deceptive or deceive ourselves about what we can and can't achieve. But actually, our mindset can help us be incredibly beneficial and help us to develop great resilience. Carol Dweck is the goddess of mindsets, and she says that the mindset we adopt for ourselves can profoundly affect the way we live our life. Our mindsets exist on a continuum between both fixed and growth that you can see on the screen now. And if you have a look at those statements, I'm sure that you can recognise some of them in yourself or in the people that you work with on a daily basis. So if we think about those mindsets and how we see them in the people we work with, people with a fixed mindset believe that their qualities can't be changed. So what they're born, or their characteristics, so things like intelligence, personality, their creativity, are all fixed traits that they can't change. They're the kind of person who might say, if you have it, you have it, you don't, you don't. Or your life is the hand you're dealt, that's that, you have to live with it. On the other hand, those with a growth mindset believe that the hand you're dealt is just the starting point for your development. So those with a growth mindset might believe that skills and qualities can be changed, can grow, that you can develop them through strategy, effort, and certainly through hard work. However, as individuals, we have a mixture of both, and we can have different mindsets in different areas of our life. So to give you an example, I was trying to think of an example from my own life, but to give you an example, I might have a growth mindset about today's challenge. So presenting to so many people, making sure my IT was ready to work, making sure I was saying the right thing. I might feel nervous about that. It's certainly a challenge for me, but I can move past that and realise that with planning and effort that I feel with a growth mindset, I can do this today. However, should you ask me to maybe sing in public, or to everybody to put their videos on and for me to sing for you, then I would certainly have a more fixed mindset about that. I don't believe I'm very good at it. I would be in panic. I would need some significant support from those around me to feel that I could do it. And actually, probably the bottom line is I'd flatly refuse. So we can have a fixed mindset or a growth mindset in different areas of our life, and it works on a continuum. So think about those people you work with and the situations that they bring to you or come to you with. Then they might have a fixed or growth mindset depending on the situation they're in. It can change according to the skills they have in a certain area, the knowledge they have about the situation they're in, or what they are currently experiencing. So for instance, you might find somebody who has a great growth mindset in an area of their life until they're made redundant. And then that confidence is shaken and they have a very fixed mindset about how to move forward. Understanding the mindset that that particular person that you're working with brings to that situation for you could help them develop. So you understanding what mindset they bring to that really gives you an opportunity to help them develop. And understanding that everybody, whatever situation they're in or whatever mindset they bring, has an opportunity to change and grow through effort, application and better experiences is, I suppose, what growth mindset is about. However, we must acknowledge that there are some major things that affect our mindset. Not just the situation we find ourselves in, but there are other things that will affect whether we can bring a growth mindset or a fixed mindset to a certain situation. The first of those is the amount of effort we put in and how that's linked to resources. So although effort is really important in growth mindset, it is worth recognizing that people have access to different resources and opportunities, and those people with fewer resources or no support system in place in their life or no safety net can be derailed much more easily. I suppose the message here is that people with money have a safety net and can take more risks, and people with access to a good education or who know the right people to support them have a better chance of success. So it is worth remembering that rich educated effort works better for growth mindset. The other thing we need to consider, I suppose, and I'm just going to see if I can move this out the way so I can see, is failure. Failure is a really big deal for those with a fixed mindset, and actually it can derail people even with a growth mindset. So if people have a fixed mindset and believe that their traits are fixed, then they are always in danger of being measured by their failures. It can really define them in a permanent way. If you have a fixed mindset over a certain situation, then your confidence will erode much more quickly in the face of some challenges you're presented with. It's worth acknowledging today with the people that we work with that somebody of a fixed mindset about a certain situation really has to nurse their confidence and will often make decisions to protect themselves from the failure. We know that failure is another step on our journey to learning more and experiencing more, but actually that inertia around for fixed mindset people about protecting themselves from failure might often mean that they won't put themselves in the position of challenge in the first place. I know you'll recognise some of these behaviours, and I thought it was definitely worth us having a look at them. But when we're trying to acknowledge or recognise a fixed mindset in a certain situation, then sometimes looking at the behaviours of the people we're working with is a good way to identify those. So I'm sure you recognise some of these, that they can be habitual behaviours that are really hard to break sometimes, but giving up easily in the face of challenges, or not facing that challenge at all by doing nothing or staying in bed. Sometimes we're in a physical activity situation when people don't want to fail, we see them cheat, or we see them blame others for their situation, or ridicule others who they feel are more successful than them because that's their coping mechanism, or picking a fight with the people who've put them in that situation. So I know that you'll recognise some of these, but in order to help people grow and to maybe find ways that we can help those in our communities with a fixed mindset, then we need to be able to identify those behaviours as a starting point. So how can we help? And I suppose that's mainly what Jane was asked me to speak today, to present really briefly what fixed and growth mindset is and how we can maybe help those that we work with on a journey to being able to have a growth mindset around those situations in their life. So finally, we're going to have a little look at how we might be able to help. And listening to Cormac this morning has been fantastic, because actually some of the things that I wanted to say to you about how we might be able to help have come through in his powerful messages this morning. So the first one of those is maybe about thinking about helping those people that we work with to engage the power of yet. So, and I suppose what we mean there, and I know Cormac didn't necessarily like the use of the word journey, but maybe we're thinking about praising the behaviours that we see along that journey rather than the outcome. And I know that you have identified, all of you, about funding being timely and having to have outcomes for that funding. But actually, if we can embrace the journey that those individuals are on and the behaviours that they make on that journey, then we can really embrace the power of yet. What we're talking about is things like focusing on the effort made, the focus, the ability to do small tasks every day, the engagement in the process that takes us to the outcome. So it might be that with those individuals, we can think about when things are fixed, that we can think about the statement of, I'm just not there yet. I just haven't done that yet. So by praising outcomes only, or focusing on outcomes only with our individuals, it means that people have no room for failure. So if we are outcome focused, then failure for ourselves in our jobs, in helping the individuals we help or the communities we help, and for those communities and individuals themselves, becomes the focus. If we're outcome focused, then failure becomes really difficult. We have no room for it. We have no room to grow. And we know that failure is going to help our growth mindset and our ability to grow. So the first one is focusing on the behaviours on that journey rather than the outcome. With the children that I work with, we don't want them to become praise junkies. We don't want them to be reliant on other people's providing them with praise, or focusing only on the outcome, so that they don't enjoy the journey and the practice and the small failures along the way. So that's the first message about maybe our focus around how we talk to those people and what we encourage and help them with. The second one is about focusing on what can be done, not what can't be done. And I suppose we're thinking about, we might be thinking about you in your job, but actually we're mainly thinking about the individuals we work with, about helping them to flip the language that they use that might be fixed mindset language to growth mindset statements. So things like, I'm sure you've heard, I'll never be any good at this, I always end up here, I'll never achieve this. And those I will never, I always are real fixed mindset statements that are really difficult to move past. And if we can help those individuals by flipping that language, by asking the right questions along the lines of maybe asking them to ask themselves, how can I be better at this? What could I achieve tomorrow? What can I control today? What would help me be better at this? So focusing those, or taking those fixed mindset statements that we must hear regularly in the work that we do, and helping those individuals to flip them to some growth statements that trying not to start our statements with don't do, and focusing on what we can do, and helping those people identify what we can do either today or tomorrow whilst on that journey to where we want them to be, or where they want to be. If we're thinking about what Cormac said this morning, where they want to be. And I suppose the last one is for us, and this came through from this morning's chats that you had in your breakout rooms and with Cormac, is that we shouldn't be the ones to provide the solutions for them. And actually, if we want those individuals we're working with to be in control of their own confidence, and to eventually find those, to build and repair their own confidence rather than relying on us or the organisations or agencies they work with to provide that for them, that we need to shift that responsibility by our offering choice and in terms of the journey that they take and the right questions that we ask to enable them to find that growth for themselves, so that they're in charge of their own confidence in the future. They can nurse it, build it and repair it, and maybe come up with those growth statements themselves as they move forward. So that was my little bit about growth mindset, and I'm sure that you guys do lots of this already. It was just a little reminder about how we can help, and that giving you the ability to recognise fixed mindsets when you see them in action, and maybe thinking about how we can move people towards more of a growth mindset to enable them to build and repair their own confidence and maybe take those small steps towards changing their life.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tony. If we could again use our chat function to thumbs up and clapping hands to thank Tony for doing that. I have to say, always going virtual is always a challenge for all of us. We're people. So we're having some trouble with our next speaker with their internet, so I think that we might just need to move on a little, but I just want to pick up on, there are some questions for Tony, and I just wanted to pick up on some of the key things that we've been doing with some of the growth mindset, and it is about the power of language, and it is about reflecting on how we think carefully about how about the way in which we put the words that we choose with our young people, our adults that we work with. It always makes me, my sister and I always laugh. We used to look in the mirror and my mum used to say, "Oh, Jane, you're the clever one, and Julia, you're the pretty one." And I have grown up all my life thinking I am ugly, and my sister has grown up all her life thinking she is thick. Actually, she did way better than me academically. Anyway, if I turn my camera on, you could perhaps see that I actually still feel a little bit.
Jane?
Exactly.
Jane, can I just add to that? Is that okay? Just with the training we've done recently, Jane's absolutely right. We did a little bit around growth mindset with some of our community coaches, and we talked about negative and positive labels. And Jane's just given you a brilliant example there about our early core experiences of significant adults in our life, and how the language they use around us is that we hold on to those labels. So Jane's held on to that, and you can absolutely see that she's not the ugly one, but we hold on to those labels for the rest of our lives. If we're told something often enough, then that's what we perceive ourselves to be, and particularly those with a fixed mindset are often afraid of losing a positive label, so they won't want it. They won't want to be told that they can do and they're good at things, because then the fear is that they will lose it, and they're afraid that they deserve the negative label, so they will become that thing. So whether we are a parent, an agency, an organisation, a teacher, a coach, or a significant adult in somebody else's life, even another adult's life, we're such a strong influencer in shaping their mindset by reinforcing some of those labels. So one of the things is maybe find out what that person's been told. I was told I was the thick one, particularly at maths when I was at school, repeatedly by my teachers. That makes it really difficult for me to face challenges around maths or finance as I move forward, because I've been told it often enough that you come to believe it. So I suppose, absolutely, Jane, language is so powerful, labelling is so powerful, questioning is so powerful, and asking the right questions is vital for growth mindset.
That's great. So I have a question here, Tony, from Michael Phillips, who said, does rich, educated, when you talked about they're much more likely to have a growth mindset, mean materially rich and educated, or more broadly in terms of relationships?
Thanks, Michael. I think in this context, we meant the financial backing to be able to fail. So it was talking about rich in terms of finance. I think it was just acknowledging that those that have a safety net will find it easier to take risks. And we know that fixed mindset, those with a fixed mindset will avoid risk or will struggle to take risks. And I suppose what we're saying is that if you have the security of, even Michael, loving, in terms of rich, loving relationships at home, whether that's partner, husband, wife, parents, loving relationships at home, a supportive network of friends, and financial support, then you are far more likely to be able to adopt a growth mindset and therefore take risks and adopt challenges. So yes, I was talking financially, but I think if we delved a bit deeper in terms of richness in our life, then yeah, those loving and supportive relationships, friendships, communities are all relevant to whether we can adopt a growth mindset or not.
We're just going to move on to some feedback through Slido. So if you could all have your mobile phones handy, this is how we're going to collect this feedback. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Okay, so if everyone could go on to Slido, if you just type this in your search engine, and then on your screen you should have a code to put in. So if you could enter the code #47329, and I'll do it with you just to make sure that it works. Okay, so you should now be able to see the question. So the question we're asking is, use one word to describe which area of your work you wish to improve resilience in. So if you type the answer on your phone and press send, we should be able to see a nice array of words coming up on the screen. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes just to pop this in. And it's really nice that we can see the more people put the same words, the bigger the words go. Brilliant, that's great. I'll just give you a couple more seconds. So we're all thinking the same: engagement and community, networking. Brilliant, great. So we'll move on to the next question now. So what would help you to do this? So this isn't just one word, you can write as much as you want. So really more around the qualitative feedback. So what would help you to do this? And again, just pop your answers in on your phone and you should be able to send that in. We will be sending this feedback as well, so if you don't get a chance to record all of this, we will send this out to you. This is brilliant, great. Just a couple more seconds for those to come in. Brilliant, there's a nice array there. Okay, and we'll just move on to the last one. So again, oh great, there's some more coming in, brilliant. Just give you a couple more seconds just to write those long bits in. Okay, brilliant, and then just moving on to the next one. Again, use one word to describe your takeaway from the learning this morning. There's some really lovely words coming in. That's brilliant. Just a couple more seconds again. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, everyone. That's really appreciated. And it's really great to see that people are feeling the same things. And yeah, very much the listening, the inspired, the growth, that's really what's coming through right now. So thank you for that. And I'll just pass you back over to Jane.
Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Tori, who I've known now for quite a while. So Tori Van Der Spiel, it's a bit of a mouthful, your surname, but Tori's now working for SASP on our Revive project, which I talked about right at the beginning, as a sports mentor. And she's really bravely going to share her journey from addiction to resilience and how physical activity has played such an important part for her, and how the people in her life have helped her. So Tori, you just need to unmute and I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Hi guys. Well, I thought I'd actually start from my childhood, but don't worry, I'm not going to whittle on for hours and hours. I was born in Holland. My father worked for KLM, which was Royal Dutch Airlines. I'll just move the mouse out of my forehead. It's very off-putting. There we go. And so basically we to and froed from Holland to England. I went to primary school in both countries. It was quite unsettling, but at the same time I made lots of friends. At the age of 9, my father announced that he was going to leave my mum and marry a young Thai bride, which of course was a bit shocking. And he went off to live in Indonesia and he built a hotel, and then before I knew it I had 6 new brothers. And even though he gave me his word that we'd keep in touch and everything would be fine, I didn't hear from him for 12 years, which I think could be the crux of how it all began. But I don't want to have any blame, because I don't think there is such a thing as blame in, you know, addiction. I'm not sure. But anyway, I was absolutely devastated. But throughout my childhood, I had horse riding, and it was something I could always go back to. And talking about resilience, it was my happy place, my safe place. I mean, these animals, they're magnificent. Well, you get adrenaline from them. You can do all sorts of things. You can compete. There's all sorts of things you can do with horses. And even just spending one-on-one time bonding with them. They're the most special creatures ever. So as you can hear, I could probably waffle for hours. I just love horses. Unfortunately, my life took a bit of a downhill spiral at the age of 13, and I began to take magic mushrooms, cannabis, LSD. I wouldn't necessarily say I got in with the wrong crowd, but I certainly got in with an experimental crowd, and I don't think it did me any favours, because it opened up the dreaded doorways of drug taking. And then slowly things became more acceptable, because I don't think anyone wakes up one day and says, oh, I know what I'm going to do today. I'm going to become a heroin addict, or I'm going to become a crack addict. It's just not how it works. And I think it gets people from all walks of life. And it's something that slowly, I think society is starting to realise this. So anyway, it was a difficult period in my life. And then I met someone called Paul, and we were together for 7 years, and I thought we'd be together for many more. And I found out I was pregnant, but unfortunately, the pregnancy was like the catalyst for him deciding that he no longer wanted to be with me. So we broke up, and the real icing on the cake was we had tickets to Europe, to go around Europe for 2 months. And we decided to take these tickets and just go as friends. But for me, it was absolute hell, because I was still in love with the guy. And I strongly believe to this day that I've still got feelings for Paul. So anyway, we had a lovely time around Europe. We got back. He was just off with his mates. And I was like, oh, well, what now? You know, I hadn't kept in touch with mine so much. It was harder for me to, you know, reform friendships. I didn't know what to do. And I just remembered that my old friend had said to me, well, if you ever want to come and try something a little bit harder, i.e. heroin, then, you know, just knock on my door. You don't have to inject it. You can smoke it. And for some reason, that seemed perfectly acceptable at the time. I was mourning the loss of a baby, the loss of a relationship. I mean, it's no excuse, but my head was, I'd given up, you know, I really was rock bottom. So I went to see this person. I actually remember that I had £2,000 in the bank. I spent the next 4 days toing and froing from my bank account to Reading, Berkshire, taking the money out, scoring, and I did pretty much 4 nights of no sleep until the money ran out. And then I was like, well, what am I going to do now? That's it. I was well and truly hooked. I had a heroin habit. Yeah, I mean, the rest you can kind of guess that I was pretty much in the gutter. And then I met somebody called Jay. And now he's the father of my eldest child, Sophia. We got on really well. And for the first 2 months, he treated me like a princess. And I'll always remember the day that I was sat in the back seat of the car and I leant forward to talk to him. And he just pommeled my head he was in the front and he just pommeled my head in between the car seat, and I couldn't get out. I was wedged in, and that was my first taste of a violent relationship. And I never thought I'd be a woman that would be sucked into anything like that. So I've realized how easily it can be done. He alienated me from my family, my friends. He had scenarios of how my best friend had tried it on with him, how my mum had leant across a fridge freezer seductively to, you know, kiss him, which, by the way, was all absolute nonsense. But he successfully kept me away from them for 6 months. So, yeah, this absolute misery went on and on and on and on until finally I actually went to prison, and that was the first time I felt safe in a long, long time. And this is what I kept saying to the girls in there. Now I finally feel safe. And when I came out of prison, I wanted a fresh start. I managed to get away from him. We got a restraining order. I got my eldest back, Sophia. I decided that this was the line of work I wanted to go in, and that I wanted to help people, and that I realized that how these women, you know, are being treated and losing everything, it's not their fault. They are really just being beaten into the ground till that there's nothing left of them. I mean, I was wishing to be dead on a daily basis here. It's absolutely awful. Like, he'd lock me in bathrooms, he'd hit me with metal bars. It's absolutely disgusting what some people are capable of. So yeah, I'm living proof that you can come out of the other side. And there's people that still need our help, and they very much are out there. So basically, my love for horses is something that is my safe, happy space. I've always been able to go back to it. I share a unique bond with them. They are probably my bestest buddies in the world, because I talk to them, actually, and they don't say much back, but they are just the most beautiful, magnificent creatures. I mean, you get adrenaline when you're galloping through a field. There's all matter of means that I could just waffle on about for ages, because I love to talk about horses, but I think you get the gist. They are just fantastic creatures, and I wouldn't change it for the world. And I just think that these people need to be shown that there is another side to life, and if it's baby steps to start with, then so be it, because it was certainly baby steps with me. And I do believe that we can help these people. We can't tell them what to do. We can only just slightly help them through doorways until we get the correct doorway for them, because recovery is different for everyone, and that's something that I've learnt. So yeah, I do hope that this has helped somewhat, because I feel like I've even got more to say, but it's kind of, I don't know if you've got any questions, because I'm more than happy to answer them.
If anybody's got any questions for Tori, please either unmute or pop them in the chat. But Tori, there's an awful lot in the chat saying thank you for your honesty and your courage, and for all of that. Very inspiring. So I don't know whether
Thank you.
does anybody want to ask Tori a question?
Jane, yeah, could I ask? Firstly, thank you for sharing that. It was really moving and great to hear that, you know, you have turned things around for you. And you said you finally felt safe when you were in prison. And we do hear lots of negative things about prison. And that's when you came out and, for me, you started a new life. But was there anything that particularly triggered you sort of coming to that conclusion and doing that when you came out of prison?
Do you mean actually why I felt safe in prison?
Yes, and then sort of what maybe then made that mind shift, I suppose, till you came out and then you did make that sort of new start.
Do you know, I was so close to my deathbed, and I knew that it's not an exaggeration at all. I'd gone down to 6.5, 7 stone. I'd been told by the doctors that I wasn't going to go on much longer if I continued, but it was if anything, it was going in one ear and out the other, because I didn't have much choice. I just felt like this was how my life was. There was no way out. I had nowhere else to go. He'd alienated me completely from my friends and family. And almost going into prison was a sigh of relief. And I just remember saying to the wardens or the screws, whatever, I know there's lots of different names, whatever you want to call them, I just remember saying, I finally feel safe. And that feeling of safety was just something I hadn't felt for so long, that I think it just overrode everything and gave me the power and the driving force to come out. I went button on my mum's address, so that all we had to do was dial 999. We didn't actually have to say anything. An officer knew straight away to come to that number and that there was a problem, because also he threatened to slit my mother's throat. So he's not, by all means, it wasn't just directed at me. He's not a pleasant chap. So yeah, it was an ugly, hideous, horrible time.
No, thank you. And great to hear that it was that feeling of safety that gave you the power. Yeah, thank you.
Definitely. No, thank you for listening. Thank you.
Has anybody got any other questions that they'd like to ask Tori?
I wondered if Tori talked about horse riding, and I'll be honest, my first thought is that's a really expensive hobby. Do you feel, certainly in the work that you do with other people and trying to get them, to be active, does the sometimes cost of sport or participation can be prohibitive and exclusive? Was that an issue for you? I mean, is there any reflections on that for us working with people?
Well, I've got a little clever way round this, actually. I first moved to Dolverton, where I tried this, and I just walked around and I looked for overgrown fields, and the power of Facebook is amazing, because I take a photo of the fields from all different angles and I just say, does anyone know whose this field is? I'm offering to maintain it, cut it all down, sort out the fencing, for a reasonable field rent. My first one that came forward, I got it for free, because he simply wanted the neighbours to stop moaning about the hedgerows being too long. My second one I got for £10 a week, and I was allowed 2 ponies on there, one for me and one for my daughter. And the one I'm at the moment, I'm paying £50 a month, which has actually got 3 ponies on. So you know, there are ways around it, and you can get a huge bale of hay for £20. I get their feet trimmed, which is £30 every 2 months. So obviously we are talking money, but it's not like livery costs are about £25 per horse per month, per week, sorry. So, you know, when you think of it that way, there are means and ways. You just need to find your overgrown fields in your areas.
Thank you. Great advice, Tori.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to thank Tori very much. It's a very brave thing to share, and I actually think really very brave to share virtually as well. And Tori talked about alienation, and it made me reflect on some of the things that Cormac had talked about how do we show up in our community. And Tori has shown up as somebody who wants to help others. She is passionate and hugely committed and enthusiastic about working with all people who have addiction, whether that's alcohol or drugs, but also very passionate about women and women who have violence practiced against them. And I think it goes back to something else that has really struck a chord with me about Cormac talking about noble hearts. So when Tori was in the gutter and feeling at her lowest, would we have seen her, or would the label have blocked what she is? And that's something for us to really reflect on. Tori has a noble heart, but would we have seen that past the label that we'd have chosen? And so it's a sobering thought for me. And I have to say, I think Tori's moved her addiction to horses. So
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tori. That was super, and there is so much love going on in the chat at the moment for you. If we could all give Tori a thumbs up or a clap in the chat, and really appreciate your sharing. So we'd really like your feedback, both on what you've heard, how it might change practice, how we all might work together and form some sort of learning community, as well as where do you think we ought to go next? Do we want to maintain momentum around our communities, and actually how we show up in those communities and how we work with individuals as people and not as service users? And that for me is really interesting.